It's his third time he's been here, so I guess he's doing a good job. I'd just like to mention one upcoming event, which is our annual trivia night, 7th annual trivia night at Camp Kiwami, which is Wednesday, July 25th at 7:30. I'd love to see you come. And I see a lot of new faces out there here tonight, so welcome to people who haven't been to one of our events. Please join me in a warm welcome for Ted Reinstein.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Thank you, Corinne. Thank you very much, Corinne. Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay. I'm wearing more wires than a cooperative mob witness tonight. I'm like... anyway, thank you all for coming. As Corinne said, this is my third visit to the Hanson Public Library, so I'm delighted about that. How many of you have been at one of my earlier talks? Very good, very good. Not enough, but very good, very good. Thank you. And this is the first time I've spoken here. I don't do a lot of talks. I speak 2 or 3 nights a week, and very rarely on a Friday night. So I was curious to see whether or not what the turnout would be, you know, for a Friday night. And this is great. I may insist on Friday nights everywhere now, which won't make my family happy, but thank you very much. So tonight, I'm going to talk to you about my third and newest book, which is all about New England's general stores, which I actually co-wrote with my wife, Anne-Marie, who's a former journalist for ABC, and we both share a love for general stores. Those at Chronicle know that in all my travels around New England over these past, well, now almost 25 years, it's hard to believe, but there are basically 2 iconic New England institutions that in all my travels I cannot pass by. One is an authentic New England diner, which of course was born in New England, in Worcester, and the other is an authentic New England general store. Now, about, I would say, maybe 15 years ago, I started to realize that diners seemed to be making something of a comeback. At the very least, they were disappearing at a less rapid rate. I know that doesn't sound like a prescription for long life, but it's better than disappearing at a rapid rate, right? And then about 10, 12 years ago, maybe even less, I started to notice that the same seemed to be true of general stores. And that really intrigued me. That really intrigued me. Because, you know, if you are interested in a diner, if you like diners, if you are out and about and want to eat at a diner, there's really no alternative to a diner, right? I mean, a diner is a unique thing. And what you get at a diner, the experience that you get at a diner, cannot really be replicated at any other eating establishment but a diner. So, I understood that if people really were into diners and more had disappeared and people sort of felt like they really wanted to hang on those that were left, that it made sense to me that diners might make a comeback. But the thing about general stores is, anything that you can buy, virtually anything that you can buy at a general store, you can buy somewhere else. And the thing is, very frequently, for less money. So why would it be, I wondered, that general stores would be making a comeback? It didn't seem to me pure nostalgia. There are plenty of other things that are disappearing and have disappeared completely that would fill one with nostalgia, that one might have a sentimental attachment to, right? And yet they've disappeared. They've disappeared. So I started to, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, to really start to ponder in more kind of detail why it was that general stores were making a comeback, why it was that small towns all around New England seemed to be feeling more of a connection with the general store, seemed to feel that it was more important to hold on to them, to preserve them, than they had over the previous 20 or 30 years when they had disappeared at 10 or 12, 15, 20, 25 a year in New England, had disappeared. And that led me to writing this book, what I found out. It led me to writing this book. So we're going to start with a little zoology lesson. So this is an example of an endangered species that was hunted to complete extinction. right? You will not find a dodo bird on the face of the earth today. This is an example of a currently endangered species that has not yet become completely extinct. So is this. Now, in terms of the kind of predator that hunted the dodo bird to complete extinction, here's an example. In terms of the kind of predator that has threatened general stores with complete extinction, I'm going to tell you right now, none of our hands are clean. You may have consorted with one of these predators recently. I know I have, just in the last week or so. Right? Right. But here's the thing. There's a reason why I chose these two very modern iterations. In fact, in the case of Target, this is still in the design phase. So there's a reason why I chose these two really modern iterations of these big box stores, right? Because the big box stores did not begin to threaten general stores with extinction. The threat to general stores began long before big box stores ever showed their face to the world. In fact, when the slide of the general store began, Sam Walton was still running things out of a single store in Missouri. It started more than half a century ago. More than half a century ago. And I always like to turn to one of my favorite chroniclers of American popular culture, John Steinbeck, to show you how far back people began to notice the slide of the general store. So here Steinbeck is pictured with, of course, his best friend Charlie. You know what? I always like to think how Mrs. Steinbeck must have felt about that. Because Charlie was always referred to as his best friend. If you're Steinbeck's wife, right, do you think she ever said to him, John, how about simply qualifying that with your best four-legged friend? Okay? Okay? Would that work? So anyway, here he is pictured with his best four-legged friend. And you may recall that more than 50 years ago, they set out in the custom-built GMC pickup with the camper in the back that became world famous, which he named Rocinante. Anybody know what Rocinante refers to? No? Who's particularly literate here? Well, it's a tricky one. Yeah, Rocinante was Don Quixote's horse. I know, now it all comes back to you. You were going to say that. So they set out in 1960 to circumnavigate America, Charlie and John Steinbeck. And look what Steinbeck noticed more than half a century ago in their travels. He noticed that the towns were getting bigger, the small villages smaller, and the small village stores, whether they were hardware stores or general stores or clothing stores, they were rapidly disappearing, not because of the big box stores, but because of the big box stores of that time, the rise of the chain store. That's what initially threatened general stores. But I can put it in easier terms, in just 3 letters, actually. You know, when Steinbeck was growing up in Salinas, California, this image, this scene, this place would have been instantly familiar to every single American. And if they didn't go to a place like this at least once a day or once a week, then their parents almost certainly did. But by the time you get 50 years out from 1900, it all changes. It all changes. And it all changes, and the threat to general stores began to be a real thing, all because of one simple 3-word thing. The car. Exactly. The car. Or as we say here, the car. So that's what the threat was. Because what did cars represent ultimately? One simple thing. Mobility. Mobility. That changed everything. Within 20 years of this picture being taken in 1950, you have the expansion and mushrooming of the interstate highway system. And then that mobility means that if you live in a small town where this is your local store and this is what you walk or ride your bike to or whatever to, but not drive to pick up, you know, a quart of milk or a carton of eggs or a pair of shoelaces, right? And this is now a time when you can step outside your house and get into your car and drive an exit or 2 on the interstate, and you have this choice. A little bit hard to compete if you're offering this choice, right? But a funny thing happened on the way to extinction. And it's the irony of ironies, it's this irony that I found in researching this book that made me actually want to go ahead and write the book. I was playing around with it, but it's this irony, a store-sized irony, that made me finally decide to write the book, because here's the thing. The same forces that seem poised to threaten general stores with complete and total extinction become the same forces that save them. Sounds like a paradox, right? But that's the whole essence of what happened and why I wrote this book. So, by the time you get to the late 60s, early 70s, certainly mid and late 70s, you have the rise of suburbia in America in a way that had never happened before. In places like suburban Atlanta, Georgia, you have suburbia is overrun by exurbia. In other words, there's no distinction anymore. You go from the urban, suburban, exurban, there's no distinction anymore. It's just one big massive sprawl, right? For 30, 40, 50, 75 miles. And it turns out that in these super communities, super suburban communities, where the boomers who are now starting families of their own, their parents could only dream of the kind of infrastructure their kids are living in, right? These super suburban communities with great schools in many cases, great school systems and community centers and great athletic programs and community pools. And in the morning, you have your choice of strip mall to drive along on the left or the right, and where you can get your choice of 12 different places to get coffee and your breakfast bun, muffin, burrito, whatever you want. So it's perfect, right? But a lot of people in these super suburban communities, by the late 70s, certainly by the early 80s, are missing something. They're missing something. I mean, if that were me, I'd be missing space, but that's me. But they were missing something that was more internal than external. Anybody guess what that might have been? Who said that? Community. Community. They were missing community. So it turns out you can live literally 10 feet from your neighbor or less and still be lonely. They were missing community. You know, in 1973, Life magazine published a poll that a lot of people found deeply disturbing. It found that a clear majority, 63% of Americans, said they had only infrequent, irregular contact with their next door neighbor. Right? So it turns out you can be surrounded by people and still miss a sense of community. So it turns out that community is not merely determined by how many people you stuff into an area. It's something different. It's something different. And it has everything to do with general stores. It has everything to do, again, both with why they began to disappear and why today there are many towns and communities all across New England that would say that their general store is more vital than ever before. Everything has to do with community. I always point out, general stores, in terms of what they mean to the towns where they exist, in terms of what they continue to mean, in terms of what they have meant to generations of people in towns where there is an authentic general store, which means to say a community gathering place, has nothing to do with a single thing that a general store sells. Not a single thing. It has nothing to do with what they sell. The reason why general stores matter is something that you can't buy. It's something you can't put a price on. It's something that you can't restock when it goes away. It has to do with community. They represent the core of what it means to belong to a community. And a lot of people, by the time we're talking about, by the mid to late 80s, who are living in suburban communities, suburbia, all over New England, all over the United States. You know, I proposed this book originally to my publisher as General Stores in America. But they thought that was going to cost too much money. So, to send me all around. So, we made it New England. But, at this point, by the mid to late 80s, people all over suburbia in New England, right, who lived in metropolitan areas, suburban metropolitan areas, many people felt they were missing the sense of community, even if they weren't aware of it, even if they couldn't put their finger on it. But one extraordinary American put his finger on what they were missing. In fact, he spent 10 years, a decade, researching what this was. And he gave a name to it, the third place. The third place. And he is one, I think, one of the more exceptional Americans who isn't really very well known, but he should be. He should be. Ray Oldenburg is a wonderful American sociologist, and he spent a decade researching what the sense of community meant in America. And in 1989, he published his book, The Great Good Place, and he gave a name to what it means when you need community, why community matters. And he called it the third place, right? So this is what Ray Oldenburg explains to us. There are three places, even though we think as Americans, right, the car gave us all that mobility, even though we think that we are free as a bird, and Americans love to think they're free as a bird, and in many ways we are. And many people have sacrificed a lot to give us that freedom. But we're not as free as we think. Not in the existential sense, but in the sense of mobility. Because what Ray Oldenburg found was, as free as we think we are to travel all over the world as much as we want, we can go every week if we want, but we don't. Instead, he found that the majority of us Americans spend the vast majority of our lives in one of just three places. The first place, you can probably guess, home, family. The second place, you can probably guess again, work, whether we like it or not. The third place is where it gets interesting. The third place in American life is not one single place. It can be one of many different kinds of places, but each one of these third places in American life has something very, very important in common. The third place could be a place of worship. It could be a place where you go get your hair done, a beauty shop or barber shop. It could be a general store where you run in to get a quart of milk or a carton of eggs. It could be a public library. God bless them and keep them, right? It could be a corner bar where they actually do know your name, right? What all these third places have in common is that when you go there, you may be going there to do a specific task, right? You may be going to pray or return a book or get your hair done or buy a carton of milk, right? But when you go to these third places, you have, even if it's just an unconscious expectation, to run into other people who are of your community. And what Ray Oldenburg found, the reason why this is important is that he found that this is not just like an add-on. This is not just like, I like that. No, we need that. People need to feel grounded where they live. And it isn't enough to feel that way at home. We want to feel validated in where we've chosen to live. It's a good thing. It's what roots communities. But what happened by the increased mobility by the 70s, 80s, that sense of community was dissolving. It still is to some extent. It was dissolving. Not all for bad reasons, don't forget. By the time you get to the 80s, you have Title IX and so forth and so on, and you have more women entering the workforce. This is all a good thing. But nonetheless, things happen, things change. And one of the things that was changing was the sense of community. And he found, Ray Oldenburg, that even if we're not aware of it, we want that, we need that sense of community, right? So by the time you get to the mid to late 80s, a lot of folks in suburbia were beginning to try to move and recover that. A lot of these boomers who were now starting families of their own felt like they were determined to find more of a sense of community than they were finding in suburbia. And they moved to small towns all across New England. And the reason why this whole long PhD dissertation is important is that without this happening, I'm not sure there would be 20 general stores left in all of New England. Maybe less, maybe half. And they would be there by default. Because what happens when these people move to these small towns, they found it. They found what they were looking for in places like Barnard, Vermont. In places like Barnard, Vermont, where they found that the same general store that was a gathering, an authentic community gathering place in 1945 was the same community gathering place in 1985. It was the same community gathering place in 2005. It never stopped being an authentic community gathering place. But what happens, a lot of these boomers also bought general stores. And it turns out that, like the products on their shelves, there's a shelf life to how long people own general stores, and it turns out to be about 20 years. And so by the time you get to about the year 2000, unfortunately, there comes a perfect storm. That's not good for general stores. So a lot of these folks who bought general stores have owned it for about 20 years, and they're getting to a point in their lives where they're thinking about slowing down, retiring, and maybe they'll sell the store to someone else. Sounds good. But by the time you get to the late 80s, 90s, we're in a terrible national recession, the economy tanks, nobody's buying these general stores. By the time you get to about 2001, in the wake of 9/11, tourism in New England is off in some places almost 90%. A lot of these general stores critically depend on tourism traffic, especially in the fall and the late spring. And a whole wave of general stores closes all over New England. And around 2000, this is when it seems like this is the end of the general store in New England. And it probably would have been. It probably would have been. But we said a funny thing happened on the way to extinction. This is the second funny thing that happens on the way to extinction. Because in a lot of these towns, towns like South Acworth, New Hampshire, a lot of these towns, something extraordinary happens. The stores close. The stores close. But people feel like in some ways, in many of these small towns, that the heart of their town is no longer beating. That the place that was this, unlike a house of worship, for example, that the store, the general store, was this completely non-sectarian, egalitarian, completely democratic, small d, where everybody gathered. And without it, people were realizing there was no natural community gathering place anymore. And in places like South Acworth, they decided it would take a village to save the store. Because of the economy, nobody was coming forward to buy these stores. And by the way, I always say at the outset what this book is not. It's not a comprehensive listing of New England's general stores. So in other words, if you're looking for a book that you'd be able to go through state by state and find every general store in that state, this is not the book. So if you want to leave now, it's okay. But what it is, it's a book that tells the story of why general stores came back from the brink of complete extinction. Because every book in here had to meet three critical metrics. They all, as I said, had to be around at least 100 years. They all had to occupy the same physical spot for all of that time. They all had to be, all of that time, a general store and never anything else. But most importantly, they all had to be a genuine community gathering place. It's not enough to call yourself a general store. You got to walk the walk and be a community gathering place. And there had been a genuine general store in South Acworth for over 100 years, almost 180 years. And in 2001, the store owners here had bucked that trend. They'd owned the store for 37 years, but in the wake of 9/11, couldn't make it work anymore financially. They closed. The store was closed for almost 2.5 years. And as I said, the town finally determined that if nobody is going to step forward to buy the store, well, they'll just have to buy it themselves. So they did. They pooled their resources. They formed a co-op. And just like a food co-op, everybody put in a few hours of work a week and got a discount on their groceries. They opened up a cafe, and people worked inside. People worked outside. With donated labor, they built a pizza oven out back where they brought in a whole new revenue stream. With Friday night pizza nights, they started having 4 harvest dinners. Now they have visiting chefs all over New England that vie to get on the schedule. And today, the South Acworth Village store is thriving like never before. And I hope the lights don't go out anytime soon in South Acworth. But in Shrewsbury, Vermont, perhaps my favorite, it takes a village story. Because here, they were not just up against the economy. They were not just up against raising money. They were not just up against finding enough people to help run a village store. They were also up against Mother Nature, who almost had the final say. Now, when this picture was taken, Marjorie Pierce, right here, was in her early 70s. And when this picture was taken, the Pierce family had already owned and run Pierce's General Store, which is, it's not only the heart and soul of Shrewsbury, Vermont. You're looking at Shrewsbury, Vermont, because the houses are mostly down little dirt roads. So this is downtown Shrewsbury, Vermont. That's it. There is no other building. Okay? Okay, having established that, so they've already owned and run the store for 75 years. By the time you get to the early 90s, if you're doing the math at home, Marjorie Pierce was in her early 90s. And at this point, frankly, she wanted nothing more than to simply take a little time off. Who could begrudge the poor woman? She's 95 years old. She can't stand on her feet anymore, but she can't run the store. Here's the problem. If Marjorie Pierce is not there to open and run the store, nobody's there to run the store. But she couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't do it. She had to close the store, and she felt terrible. She felt terrible. She felt very guilty every time she heard people, reminiscing and really kind of, sometimes she overheard people talking about how much they wished that they'd been able to keep the store open. She felt terrible. She couldn't do it, but she felt terrible. So she called up a good friend of hers who happens to be one of my very, very favorite New Englanders, Paul Brune. Now, Paul Brune is really a visionary, pioneering figure. You may not have heard of him, but I suspect you have nonetheless appreciated what Paul Brune and his organization have accomplished. Because they started out doing it in Vermont. Today they do it all across America. And what they do, quite simply, is help cities and towns hold on to their history. They don't do it because it feels good. They don't do it because they have an overdeveloped sense of nostalgia. They do it because they have found the towns that hold on to their history. We could be talking about a historic shopping district, a historic theater, a general store. Because towns they have found that hold on to their history have a better path to economic sustainability in the future than towns that get rid of their history. And they have the data to prove it. Now, when Marjorie Pierce called up her friend Paul, she wasn't calling up to talk about data. She called him and said, "Paul, I need to talk to you." So Paul, being the good man that he is, jumped into his beat-up Prius, drove down from Burlington, because what else would you be driving from Burlington, Vermont? And he drove down to Shrewsbury, and Marjorie Pierce said, "Paul, I need to reopen the Stoa." And he said, "Marjorie, how are you going to do that?" And she said, "Oh, I'm not going to do it, you are." He said, "I'm sorry." She said, "I'm going to give you the Stoa. And I'm going to give you $10,000, which is pretty much all the money I have, but I don't expect to need it too much more." And he said, "Marjorie, dear," he said, you know that we don't own property outright, the trust. We don't." He said, "You know that what we do is we help cities and towns invest in their own property. We help cities and towns take ownership of their own history in their property. But we don't own property outright. It's not what we do. It's not our mission." And she said, "Piffle." Well, it went back and forth for about 35 minutes, according to Paul. But long story short, about 35 minutes later, Paul was back in his beat-up Prius, making his way back up to Burlington, and the Preservation Trust owned its first piece of property outright. And he said, "What can I tell you? I couldn't say no to this woman." So, needless to say, he came back to Shrewsbury, Vermont a couple of weeks later, and he had asked the local historical society to convene, led by my friend, Sally Deinzer, and he said, "I need to talk to you folks." And they got there and they met at the store, and he said, "Look, the reason why I need to talk to you all is that you are going to run the store." And they said, how are we going to do that, Paul? I mean, we're happy to help, but we're farmers, craftspeople. And somebody said, "Paul, I make macrame." And he said, "We've done this before. Don't worry. We're going to take 2 years, and we're going to send you to school." And they did. They sent them to school, Preservation Trust style. They sent them all off on 2 years of field trips to other general stores and small businesses that used this model of community-developed enterprise, and they learned how to take inventory and how to outfit a store and how to stock shelves, and they completely renovated the interior Pierces. I'll tell you, I don't know what you think, but I feel, having visited hundreds of general stores, I always feel like the interior Pierces looks almost unreal in terms of how authentic it is. Like, it looks like what you would get if you're a Hollywood studio and you pay a designer $500,000 to design a set for a general store. But that's exactly what it looks like. It's exactly what it looks like. I sat in the red chair just last November, and it didn't go off like without any hitch at all. Don't forget, these are people who've never run a business. And they had hiccups along the way. Just before they reopened, they went to the town and they asked for it. Mind you, this is a town of just under 900 people. And nonetheless, they raised $65,000. Okay, so they love that store. But just before they reopened, they went back to the town and they asked for another $2,000. Uh-oh. So there was a lot of grumbling, right, about that. A lot of people said, well, Marjorie Pierce never needed an emergency generator. But they said, the point was, they said, listen, if we are going to be a genuine community gathering place through thick and thin and the worst that a Vermont winter can throw at us, we need the community to know and have confidence and faith in the fact that we will be open and we will be there through thick and thin. Well, there was a lot of grumbling. Nonetheless, they got the emergency generator and they reopened in 2009 and everything was working and spick and span and the beating heart of Shrewsbury, Vermont was beating once again until Mother Nature had her say 2 years later. Now, you may recall that in 2011, late August 2011, Hurricane Irene, which by the time it reached New England had been downgraded to a tropical storm, but hey, big diff, right? Because even though it wasn't a hurricane anymore, it had made this extraordinary, meteorologically, extraordinary northwestern turn, right, for Vermont, which hurricanes never do. This is a state that is not set up to weather hurricanes, and it didn't weather it very well. And it's the worst natural disaster today in Vermont's history. And even though it was now packing 65-mile-an-hour winds instead of the 75 of an official hurricane, it still swept away 200-year-old covered bridges all over the state like so much driftwood. And the first day of Irene, all over Vermont, the power went out everywhere. It was a state without power, essentially. The lights went out everywhere, including in little Shrewsbury, Vermont, except one little spot. Because at Pierce's, Sally Deinzer and her crew walked out through the howling rain and the wind and the flying debris, and they fired up that emergency generator, and the lights came on, and to hear Sally tell it, she said, she looked out those windows late day, the first day when this picture was taken of Irene, she said, it looked like something out of Night of the Living Dead. She said, you could see people coming out of the trees. And they were seeking out the light. And they got to the store, and the lights were on, and the Wi-Fi was working, and the coffee was hot, and people were able to call relatives and tell them everything is okay. And curiously, no one's ever bellyached about the generator again. Now, we've talked so far about the initial wave of saving the general stores. If this period didn't happen, when villages took it on themselves to save the general store, as I said, I am firmly convinced there would be less than 20 general stores still surviving in New England today. I'm convinced. Instead, there's almost 300. So that wave was critical, but now it's important to point out that in some cases it didn't take a village, it just took one remarkable individual who was able to buy a store that was threatened with being lost. One of my favorites is in Carlisle, Mass., Ferns in Carlisle, where I like to joke that in the chapter, Honey, I Bought the Store, that my friend Larry Beerfield is the only person in that chapter to actually utter those words verbatim to his lovely wife, Robin. He came home and he said, honey, I bought the store. Yeah, I know, Rob, I told Larry, you're very lucky she didn't say, honey, I hope you still have the receipt. But he bought it, they made it into a wonderful thing. My favorite, though, Honey, I Bought the Store, is perhaps the most unlikely general store owner, maybe in the world. This is, of course, Hollywood star Steve Carell, and who actually has a home down in this area. You may be I'm sure most of you know that very well. Steve Carell, otherwise known as, should be America's worst boss. When I interviewed Steve for the book, I asked him, wait, play a game with me for a minute. Maybe some of you don't know this. So, close your eyes for a minute. Close your eyes. And get a picture in your mind of what comes to mind, to your mind's eye, if you imagine a husband and wife who are the proud owners of an old, historic New England general store. Right? Husband and wife, proud owners, old, authentic New England general store. Do you have that image in your head? Okay, open your eyes. Does it look like this?
No.
No? Oh, what, you can't wear a tuxedo to the general store? Well, you are looking at the proud husband and wife owners of an authentic old New England general store. So when I interviewed Steve, as I said, I asked him, where does your interest in general stores come from? And he said that when he was growing up in Acton, Massachusetts, he said there was a general store, long gone now, unfortunately, but he said it was the first place that he was allowed to go as a little boy, little Stevie, on his little bike, probably with the banana seat and the high handlebars, right? And he was allowed to go with his own little allowance jingling around in his little saddlebag in the back of his bike and buy candy at the local store. How many of you had the same experience? Right? I find so many people had the same experience. Certainly was true, it was the same for me. Now, I grew up a little bit to the northeast of here, Winthrop, Massachusetts, or as I like to refer to it, the charming little seaside town at the end of runway 27L. It was a noisy childhood, let me tell you. But same thing. Little local store, was I allowed to go on my bike. And it was the same for Steve's lovely wife, Nancy, who also grew up right down here in the South Shore. She grew up in Cohasset. And summer nights, she and her big sister Tish went next door. How many of you have been to the Marshfield Hills General Store? Okay. I mean, I certainly see hands going up here that I don't see, say, when I asked that in Sturbridge. But that's where they went on summer nights, to their favorite general store. Now, about 15 years ago, Nancy's big sister Tish went out to LA to visit her sister and her famous brother-in-law. And she told Nancy that the Marshfield Hills General Store is up for sale. And Nancy said, oh my God, who's gonna buy it? And Tish said, nobody seems like they want to buy it. It's been on the market for about 6 months. And then she pulled out a copy of the Globe she had with her from the plane, and she said, look at this. Now I saw today this local developer says he wants to turn it into condos. And at that point, Steve said he overheard this and went in the kitchen. Long story short, when Tish came back east that Christmas time, she had with her a check to purchase the Marshfield Hills General Store. And as I said, it is an authentic old New England general store. It really is. In fact, it's one of the few remaining general stores in New England that has a working post office attached to it. Now, that used to be the case with virtually every store in New England. But the post office doesn't like that arrangement much anymore, and they're harder and harder to find. But you still find that at the Marshfield Hills General Store. During the Civil War, on the 3rd floor, they stitched Union Army uniforms. And I think that Steve and Nancy Carell and Tish and their design team, I think they did a fabulous job of kind of saving that historical integrity of the store. Don't you? Right? And Steve, in fact, made his sister-in-law Tish the general manager of the store. She manages it today. Maybe some of you know her. And today, the Carells own a house in Cohasset. They're out here for a few weeks every summer. And no summer now in Marshfield Hills is complete without a confirmed Carell sighting. Right? Without a confirmed Carell sighting. Now, we've talked so far about saving the general store. I'm going to return to that at the end, but I do feel, you know, in putting this talk together, I felt like it was important also not just to talk about stores that were threatened and were saved, but it was also important, I felt like, to pay some homage, if you will, to some general stores that have never needed saving. Not because nobody cares, but because people care so much. They've never been up for sale. In some of these towns where these stores exist, what I call tried and true, it's impossible for people to imagine the general store not being there, right? One of my favorites is up in Warren, Vermont, Upper Vermont, in the Green Mountains, the Warren store. Anybody ever been to the Warren store? Yeah? Have you ever had a sandwich from the Warren store? Oh my goodness, you haven't lived then. You gotta get a sandwich from the Warren store. They're about this big. Anyway, the Warren store, like, as I said, all the stores in the book, has been around for almost 200 years. There it is in the 40s, but it's been around for just over 200 years. And it is the heart and soul of Warren, Vermont, up there in ski country, kind of equidistant between Waitsfield and Warren. And I was last up at the Warren store 2 years ago, just this past March. And it was March 2016, and whether you care to remember it or not, it was a presidential primary time of year. And all I will say, and it was, I dropped in to say hi to my friend Jack Garvin, who owns the store. I said, Jack, what's new? And he said, oh, what's new, what's new? He said, we're having some fun right now. We have a contest going to name the wood stove. Now, most general stores you'll find some form of a wood stove. What makes the Warren store unique is that the wood stove is huge. It is the defining characteristic of the store when you walk in, right? And they were having a contest to name it. And I said, well, have you had any good candidates for a new name yet? And he said, funny you should use that word. So it turns out just a week before me, another longtime friend of the store had dropped in to say hi, and Jack had told him about the contest. And he was obviously quicker on his feet than I am, and he had a suggestion for what they should name the store. He said, I have a suggestion, and they liked it. They liked it. And then he went back up to Burlington to finish doing his laundry and hit the trail again. So, but I've always wondered, now just 2 months after that, he was very disappointed, Bernie Sanders was, when he failed to secure the Democratic nomination for president. But I've always wondered if perhaps he took some small solace in the fact that he did win the stove naming contest at the Warren store. That's not nothing. Now, there is another category, which is all of the above. And in some ways, it's almost my favorite, not quite maybe my favorite chapter, but what I love about these stores, and I'm just going to tell you quickly about two of them, is that they're all of the above, right? They've never needed to be saved. They are tried and true, and they are one of a kind. They are so unique that they are one of a kind. You can't compare them to any other general store. And as you'll see in one case, to any other store in the world. Now, one of them is up in the Upper Valley of New Hampshire, Vermont, in Norwich, Vermont. I always want to say Hanover, which I'm more familiar with, but it's just over the Connecticut River from Hanover. And it's in the Upper Valley area. And Dan and Whit were not the original owners of the store. They actually were high school buddies who worked at the store in the 1930s, and by the 1950s, they owned the store. And they did very well. They did so well, they felt confident enough to put this sign in the window. Now, you'll see variations of that sign in many general stores. The reason I include it here is that I always say at the Dan and Witt's, it might actually be true. Now, they did well, and they wanted to expand. Problem was, they had no place to expand in kind of the front of the store where you could actually see the expansion, which that was what they wanted to do, right? They couldn't expand on this side because there was the Norwich Inn is here, and they couldn't expand on this side because there's a street. So their only choice to expand was directly behind the store, where there's about 3/4 of an acre. But it's not very wide, it just goes back for almost an acre. So that's what makes this so unique. When you drive up and look at the Warren store, that's what you're looking at. That's exactly what you're looking at. But you're not seeing, it's like an iceberg. You're not seeing 2/3 of it, right? Because when you walk in, this is what you see. And where those guys are standing at the refrigerator is not any further from where I'm standing to those windows, right? But if you walk just to the left of where they are, just over by the meat counter, there's just a simple doorway. There's no door, there's no sign, but if you walk through the door, you're in the back. And in the back, just for example, you'll find a ceiling that looks much like a big box store, and it is mammoth. You're looking at almost over 3/4 of an acre of store right here, and it just goes on. That's not the end of it. That just goes to another aisle, and then it goes back again, and it's kind of like, think of like a corn maze, but with products. Now, you could get lost in a corn maze, many people do, and you could get lost in Dan and Witt's, and I did. It's very embarrassing. You know, because it's kind of like getting lost in a corn maze. It's not like you don't know where you are. You're still not getting out right away, right? So I finally found my way out, and I said to Dan Frazier, who's the original Dan's grandson, I said, Dan, I just got lost in the back. And he said, oh, that happens all the time. I said, really? He said, oh, yeah. Yeah. So it turns out that at Dan and Witt's, they have the equivalent, the commercial equivalent of what I can only describe as the ski patrol for a store. Right? So I don't know how many of you ski, but you know, when ski areas close, usually 4, 4:30, depending on the season, when the lifts close and nobody's being allowed to go back up the hill, they send the ski patrol down every slope and every trail to flush them out, right? And make sure, God forbid, somebody's hurt and would be there after dark. So every night at 9 o'clock at Dan and Witt's, they send someone out into the back to flush it out. And I said to Dan, I said, well, you ever find anybody back there? He said, me all the time. I said, really? Oh, yeah. He said, all the time. He said, once a week we find some 10-year-old kid walking around back there. I said, that's terrible. He said, no, you know what's really weird? He said, most of the time we know for a fact their parents left like an hour ago. Are you 10? But you would never leave without me. No, never. But my favorite one of a kind is in Windsor, Maine, where Harlan Huzzy, looks like Hussey, but he was a German immigrant, pronounced it Huzzy. He also did very well. Now, he started out with a little one-story, humble little, almost like a one-story garage-type general store, and it did very well. All through the 20s and 30s and 40s, it did so well, he was able in the 1950s to expand to a 3-story commercial colossus that exists today, where you have 3 floors. You have a basement, you have a ground floor, and you have an upper floor. And what makes Huzzy's unique in all the world is that they sell a combination of products you will not find anywhere else on the face of the earth except in Little Windsor, Maine. Now, what is that? Start reading this sign from the bottom if you want to get maximum effect. Okay, so this is the sign you will see when you walk in. Okay? So far, no surprises. Wood stoves, home and garden, plumbing, electrical, paint, hardware, camping gear, fishing, hunting supplies, guns, bridal gowns, clothing. Whoa, what? Hello. Right. Didn't see that coming. No, nobody does. So it turns out that little humble Huzzy's in Windsor, Maine is the only general store on the face of the earth that sells the unique combination of guns, gowns, and beer. Which they're very proud of, understandably. Right. Basically, what they have done is they've carved out a niche to be your one-stop shopping for your next shotgun wedding. Which is exactly what Harlan Huzzy's granddaughter Kristen had some fun with on her wedding day. This is Kristen's wedding photo, and here she is, the lovely bride holding her bridal bouquet, a 6-pack of Schlitz, and the groom is holding a brand new 12-gauge. Now, and the sign has been on Letterman. Now, since we're having so much fun, I thought we should turn serious for just a moment. So, you know, when I put this talk together about 8 months ago, it ended kind of close to here. But, you know, every night I do a book talk. No, I don't do a book talk every night, but every night that I do a book talk, I always, you know, as I will tonight, I always take, if anybody has some questions, I'm always happy to take some questions. And I noticed that as soon as I began giving this talk, that every night, invariably, if it wasn't the first question, it was the second or third question. Somebody would ask me if I have a favorite general store. And invariably, I noticed over time that I did. And it was the same answer. I seemed to go through the process of thinking about it, but I came up with the same store every single night. So I started to think about, okay, I should think about why that's my favorite general store for no other reason than I'd like to know that, because I hadn't thought about that before. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized it was my favorite general store because not only did it in many ways typify the kinds of stories that I had been interested in telling for 25 years, which is to say the story of an underdog, story of something fighting back, whether it's a person, a town, an old mill town, or a recovering seaport, trying to reinvent itself, or a person who's overcoming sometimes awful odds, right, to just claw back to a productive life. Those are the stories I've always been attracted to. And I thought this store embodies that perfectly. And I thought it also completely embodies the sense of why general stores matter today more than ever, right? Why the sense of community is something that some communities will not let go of. And nothing typifies that more than the Putney General Store in Putney, Vermont. Nothing. Not a single store. The irony, it doesn't, the thing is about the Putney store, it's not terribly different than many other general stores. It's not extraordinary. It doesn't sell anything. No guns, guns, and beer. It doesn't sell anything that you can't find at any number of other general stores. It hasn't been around longer than many general stores, although it's been around for over 200 years. It's always occupied the same spot, right on the top of Little Sackett's Brook in the middle of Putney, Vermont, population just under 1,000. Except when it wasn't there. Remember I said the metric had to be for these stores, they all had to be there for at least 100 years, they all had to have been nothing but a general store for all of that time, and they all had to have occupied the same physical footprint for all of that time. And yet Putney is in the book, and there was a period of time when it wasn't there. The first time was in 2008, when a fire broke out about 1 o'clock in the morning in the 3rd floor, faulty wiring. And thank God for volunteer fire departments. Do you have a volunteer force or a full-time force here in Hanson? Full-time? When you're dealing with a volunteer fire department, you've got people who are giving it their all, and they don't have to be, and they are, but the fire gets put out only as quick as you can muster, because they're not at the firehouse waiting, right? And they mustered very quickly in Putney, terrific job. And they were able to save almost 2/3 of the building. And although that looks bad, they were able to save almost 2/3 of it. And it fell to my friend Lisa Papazian, who was head of the local historical society, and the first order of business for Lisa on the morning after the fire was to call up our good friend, Paul Brun. And she said, Paul, I need to talk to you. And he got in his beat-up Prius and he drove down to Putney. And he talked and he said, well, here's the first thing we need to do. So here was the first problem. See, this is why they want communities to invest in their own property. Because the owners of the Putney store had no insurance. And it was a complete, total loss. So they were terrified they were going to lose the property, that there was nothing that could be done. How could they possibly save this store? And Paul, helped Lisa and the Historical Society, said the first order of business, we are going to get you folks to be owners of the store. And he worked with Bernie Sanders and the state's governor and Pat Leahy, and they were able to cobble together federal funds and state funds and matching grants, and they raised over $150,000, and they were able to rebuild the store. They were able to rebuild the store, and they were now the owners of their own general store, and the store reopened, and the beating heart of Putney was beating once again. For a year and a half. That's a year and a half later. And as bad as this looks, it's so much worse. How could it look worse? It was a complete loss, burned right down to the foundation stones, gone, gone. Wet, smoking ash, gone. How could it be worse? Because this time there was no faulty wiring, but this time investigators found traces of massive accelerant throughout the building. Arson. So this time, people in Putney had to deal with the double gut punch that not only had they just lost the heart and soul of their community for over 200 years, but the person who did this horrible thing might be their neighbor. Who knows? And for people in Putney, it felt like a death in the family that late fall. It felt like a death in the family. And in many ways, that was actually quite true, in a real sense, because the store was like extended family for the whole town. There's no one in that town who wasn't in that store once or twice a day, at least several times a week. And now it was gone. And Lisa Papazian again called Paul Brun, who again trekked down to Putney, but this time he was a lot more somber. He said, Lisa, I don't know what we can do. It's only a year and a half. The federal money is still in the pipeline. We don't even have it yet. I don't know what we can do. But you know I will help in any way I can. And they met, the local historical society, they met with Paul at the church across the street from where the store stood, and after about half an hour, about 50 more people showed up. After more than an hour and a half, over 100 people from town had gathered at the store, at the church. They needed to move the meeting outside into the cold open air. And after about Another 20 minutes or so, there was a lot of anguish, a lot of tears. And finally, an older gentleman whose family went back 5 generations in Putney stood up on the low stone wall there and he said, "I have one thing to say." He said, "I will be goddamned if an arsonist will define my town." And Paul Brune kind of let those words hang in the chilly December air. And he said, "Well, it looks like we need to rebuild then." And they did. The only saving grace, the only silver lining in this tragedy was that this was such an extraordinary tragedy that it was front page news, not only all over America, but internationally. And money poured in to Putney. And they were able to rebuild the store in record time. They got donated labor from sawyers and timber folks, and they were able to rebuild the store. They rebuilt it bigger. They rebuilt it better. They rebuilt it brighter. They needed someone to run the store, because remember, the locals, the Historical Society merely owned the store. They needed someone to run the store, and they caught a lucky break. A wonderful gentleman who had been an immigrant to Putney. He felt that his family had been made to feel accepted in Putney because of the store. He felt like that was like a place that they all felt like they were at home and accepted. And he said, he was a pharmacist, and he said, "If I can run the pharmacy out of the second floor, I would be glad to run the store." And they said, "Great." And all was good until January 1st, 2017. I warned you. This is like, Putney is like the Rocky of general stores, right? Keeps getting beaten and keeps getting back up, because on January 1st, 2017, 1 year ago this past January, New Year's, this wonderful gentleman died. And his children, neither one of them wanted anything to do with running the store, and the store closed. But this time, Paul Brune, hearing about it, he called up Lisa Papazian and he said, "Lisa, you got to reopen that store." And she said, "Paul, we don't have enough people." He said, "How many people do you have in the Historical Society now?" She said, 43. He said, "Good. Everybody work an hour and a half a week as a skeleton crew till you get it open, and reopen that store." Because he said, "I'm telling you, and I have the data to prove it, the longer you're closed, the longer it will be before you reopen. People will get used to you being closed. You got to reopen." And they did. They reopened last May. I was up there, and it is beating once again the local heart and soul of Putney, Vermont. And as Paul Brune says, it is truly about perseverance. And as I close, you know, I feel like, you know, with a journalist's sense of truthfulness, I have to tell you, you know, all these wonderful stories of stores being saved does not mean that there haven't been heartbreaking losses of general stores. The most significant was just 6 years ago, in 2012, in Little Compton, Rhode Island, the little village of Adamsville, where Gray's closed. When it closed in 2012, it was the longest continuously operating general store in America. It had been in business for 224 years. That's only 20 years less than the country had been in business, but it closed. And most heartbreaking of all, in some ways, is the little Monterey General Store. You know, when this book was published, the Monterey General Store was in here, because it was open. And just 8 months ago, closed. So it's a fragile thing. It's a fragile thing. General stores will only stay open and be saved as long as communities care to save them. And without a new breed of general store owners, none of them will be saved. I will tell you right now, without a new breed of general store owners, I think that there would be fewer. I said 20. I'm not sure if there would be 20 general stores in 20 years without a new breed of general store owners. You need new blood. You need new people who feel invested in owning and operating and running a general store. And ironically, this new breed is exemplified by really young store owners, really young, millennials, under 30. Now, you might think that this would be a generation that perhaps, by popular perception, would not be a generation that feels as invested in being out and about and mixing it up with other people if they can do what they're doing online. But they are. No, they are. They are. There are some wonderful millennials that are saving general stores because they feel unusually invested in what it means to be part of a community. And as I close, my favorite couple that is doing this is Ben and Taryn Marcus. They're doing it in Whitefield, Maine. Now, Ben and Taryn might look marginally more like a general store owner than, say, Steve and Nancy Carell. Okay? I don't know if Ben owns a tuxedo. I'm banking heavily on that he doesn't. However, they've got a good excuse. They're farmers. They're farmers. They never had any interest in running a general store or any other kind of business. They met at agriculture school in Washington State. They moved back to Whitefield when they graduated because their hope was they would be able to afford a few acres of land to farm. But farmland in north central Maine is very expensive, and they weren't having any luck. So finally, a gentleman came up to them one day, and he said, look, I know you're trying to afford some farmland. So he said, I'm going to make you a crazy offer. He said, I will give you 5 acres of farmland. And they said, oh, what's the catch? And he said, the catch is there is a long-closed general store, Sheepscot General, on that land. I've always thought maybe I would reopen the store, but I don't think that's going to happen. But he said, if you will reopen and run that store, the land is yours. And they still deliberated. That's how much they didn't want to run a store, right? So finally, they hedged their bets. They decided they'd only buy stuff for the store that they liked, especially food. They decided they'd only inventory the store with food that they like to eat, personally. No, because their thought was, naturally, this thing is going to go belly up, and when it does, we can personally liquidate the inventory. We won't have to go food shopping for 2 years. But that didn't happen. That didn't happen. Oh, the land produced all right. The land produced all right. Extraordinary organic produce that people started driving 20 and 30 miles to come and buy, and they were selling it at the store. And then after about 6 months, they thought to themselves, wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to drive hundreds of miles every week to hit every single farmer's market in southern New England, which is what you have to do today as a farmer, in most cases. They said, what if instead of just selling our produce, we could open up a cafe in the store and find somebody who would cook with our produce? And they did. They found a wonderful person to do just that. And now people started driving to have breakfast at the store like they used to do. And then they started creating and offering all kinds of stuff. Now here's what's interesting, and here's what general stores have in common with public libraries. You know, the dirty little secret, I'm passionate, by the way, about public libraries. And the dirty little secret, nonetheless, of public libraries today, and I know librarians to a person will agree with me, is that they are not so much about books anymore. Surprise, surprise. Because people have many ways of getting books, right? But they don't have many ways of finding that sense of a third place. You can't do that on Amazon. It can do many things. It can't, thank the good Lord, offer you a third place, right? But public libraries can. General stores can. So public libraries today know that if you want to stay in business, as it were, bless you, you need to offer your community all kinds of different services, right? And what works in Hanson, for instance, is not necessarily what works in East Boston, where you have an immigrant population of more than 80%. And they need a whole different range of services, right? General stores have realized the same thing. The new breed has realized the same thing. At general stores, if you want to be a general store purist, right, and feel like, well, what is a wine tasting doing at a general store? And it's true. If you were last into the Sheepscot General Store 130 years ago, and you walked in, that's what you would say. What is a wine tasting doing at my general store? And what is open mic? What's a mic? Right? You're right, you would. That's okay. But you know what? Wine tastings, open mic nights, yoga classes, childcare, these are the services that are keeping general stores alive today. Because today, they are offering services to communities that are not the communities of 130 years ago. And the new breed of general store owners have realized it. They realize it in Sheepscot General, and this gives hope, I believe. And what could give more hope than the reopening of Hope General Store in Hope, Maine in 2016, that because of this new breed of general store owners, I do have faith now. Not all, there will still be losses, but I believe that because this new breed feels this great sense of community and what general stores, why they matter more than ever, that they will still be around in 25 years. And that is New England's general stores. Thank you. Thank you. Now, So true to my word, I'm happy to take a few questions if anybody has a question or two, but now you don't have to ask me what's my favorite general store. So any questions? Any questions? Any questions? Yes, right in the middle, ma'am.
If their goods are so much more expensive than the box stores, for instance, how do they stay alive? How do they sell
Right.
their goods?
Well, when I said that you can frequently find, I don't think I said their goods are super expensive. I said, but frequently you can find anything you can find in a general store, except at Huzzy's. You can find anything you can find in a general store at any other store. What it said was, and frequently you can find it for less. But that doesn't mean that, I wouldn't say that most general stores, the products are fabulously more expensive. And in many cases, and this is also something the new breed of general store owners are learning, is they're also learning, which is economics 101, they're now learning, and the trend line now is cheaper, go cheaper. Because now they feel like, look, general stores need every single advantage they can get. They didn't used to have to worry about being cheaper than anybody, underselling, because, you know, for the first 200 years of their existence, they didn't have competition. But they are learning now. I would say it's changed, and I would say now there are many general stores where it would be less. It would be less. Not everything. You know, you can't offer, you know, meats and cheeses, you know, a whole lot less than what you have to pay for it. So, not in every case, but no, I wouldn't say the general stores are by and large a lot more expensive, and I would say the trend line is actually getting less expensive.
Well, in comparison to like the Vermont country store.
Well, the Vermont Country Store is not your average general store. No. The Vermont Country Store is a huge exception. It's in the book, which might surprise you, because it also, as you might, if you're familiar with the Vermont Country Store, which is a mail-order colossus in western Vermont, you're probably thinking, well, why is that in the book, right? So, the reason why the Vermont Country Store is in the book is that it is a fascinating story. Do you know the history of the Vermont Country Store? Yeah. So the Vermont Country Store is a fascinating story. I'll just give you the quick 2-minute, less than 2-minute. It starts out with its roots in a completely authentic Vermont Country Store in North Grafton, Vermont, started by an old fella and his son-in-law. Okay? And the son-in-law decides to move with his growing family, and they move to Massachusetts, north central Massachusetts, where he opens his own general store. Okay? He has a son. The son, now we're into the 30s, 40s, and the son goes off to war. He goes to Washington, where he's stationed, and the store in north central Massachusetts closes. He comes back to western Vermont, now with his new wife Mildred, and they decide that everywhere they go, when they tell people they're from Vermont, they say, oh, we love Vermont and Vermont maple syrup and those wonderful little Vermont products that we get. And they said, you know what? We should sell authentic Vermont products through the mail, which was just a brand new idea, right? And they did. They used their Christmas card list to sell people through the mail authentic Vermont products, like Vermont maple syrup. And it took off. And Look magazine, in the early 1950s, decided to do a story about him. You know, it's important to research when you do a story. I know this, and I have never been able to ascertain if they really cared or didn't care or found out and left that out. Either way, they did a wonderful story of the happy little storekeeper in Vermont. Okay? Mr. Orton. What they neglected to say was, there was no actual store where he was so happy, right? And so now, people read this and they said, oh, that's so, I want to visit the store. Problem, no store. There's their kitchen where they send this stuff out to the mail every day. So they had to open a store. So they did. And they bought what had been a defunct general store, and they reopened it. And they reopened it. And it was, in the mid-1950s, it was the first reopened general store in New England. And they reopened it. And it did very well. It did so well, it became the colossus of the Vermont Country Store. Great story. Funny story. Ironic story. It would never have been in my book because the Vermont Country Store today is not a genuine community gathering place. It is a gathering place for massive leaf-peeping bus tours in the fall. Nothing wrong with that, but it's not an authentic community gathering place. Why is it in the book? Because that man's son and grandsons, the Ortons, do more than any other living person to save general stores in New England. The Orton family has a foundation that is dedicated to helping at-risk general stores. They keep them going all over New England. There are at least 20 general stores that I know of that have gotten an infusion of cash when otherwise they would have had to close, because that's how invested the Orton family is in keeping alive its great-grandfather's original general store concept of what a real community gathering place is. They know they're not one, but they still walk the walk when it helps places do it who are. That's why they're in the book. That's the story of the Vermont Country Store. Anybody else? Anybody else? I promise to keep my next answer to 30 seconds. Yes?
Was the Putney arsonist ever found?
The Putney arsonist was never found. The crime has never been solved. However, people in Putney take a lot of comfort from the fact, you know, fire officials tell me, experts tell me that arsonists frequently strike again, especially in a close radius to where they have set one fire. And there's never been, knock on wood, there's never been another fire. And local banks in Putney often joke that you really should put your money in the Putney General Store because it's more secure than our bank. It's a very secure place today. But no, they never, but their feeling, I think, is that whoever that person was moved on, thank God. Anyone else? Anyone else? So, yes, yes.
So, what made you want to write a book about general stores?
What made me want to write a book about general stores? You're 10 years old? You know, when I started writing this book, my youngest daughter was 10. And what made me want to write the book is that I really, really love these places like general stores that are places where people who live in a town, right, go and they feel like they can run into their neighbors, you know? Because you can go to big stores, you've been in big stores, right? You've been in Targets and stuff, right? And those are fine, but people go there, you know, don't you feel like when you go in there, you want to get in there and get out, right? You want to get what you need to get done and get back out, right? The difference in these general stores is that people go in these places and they feel like they want to hang around for a while. That makes them really special. It makes people feel like when they go in these stores that they're with their neighbors, and wow, they go in to buy the quart of milk, and the person behind the counter actually says, "Hey, Fred, how's Louise? How's she doing? Is her hip healing up okay?" I don't think in the history of humankind anybody has ever said that to a customer at Target. Maybe, but I'm going to go out on a limb. Maybe. Anyway, does that answer your question? So I love these places because I love places like that. You know, that's why I also like diners, you know, because they're places that people want to tarry. And people want to tarry in places that are comfortable and warm and inviting, you know. Anyone else? Someone over here. Yes, ma'am.
I notice all the stores have a stove in them. Are they working stoves?
Oh, in most cases. So I can think of one case right off the bat where it's not a working stove anymore. And that is Brown and Hopkins in Little Chepachet, Rhode Island. But the reason why that store is in here, it's a little sidebar. It is also questionable in terms of community gathering place. It kind of sells knickknacks now. And its stove is no longer working because it is not a place that people necessarily are going to come in and kill time on a cold day. But the reason I included it, it's been a general store for 200 years and in the same spot, but it also is the most haunted general store that I know of. So I felt like it was, yes. So it sells, you know, like they do consignments for local craftspeople, you know. And the one that most intrigued or amused me was, so they had a mannequin, a dress mannequin, around which a local weaver was doing consignment on beautiful woolen scarves, right? There was about a dozen of these scarves. And the owner told me that she didn't have time. When she was leaving, they had just been dropped off, and it was late that day. She was about to leave. She figured, well, I'll put them nicely and arrange them nicely in the morning on the mannequin. But right now, she just kind of left them in a clump on the edge of the counter and locked up the store and went home. And when she came back in the morning, they were more beautifully arranged on the mannequin than she figured she could have done. She's the only person with a key to the store. So I had to put it in the book. Anyway, listen, thank you very much for coming out tonight. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. No, I really appreciate it. This is every time I have come to speak in Hanson, there has been this wonderful turnout. So either you really enjoy hearing me talk or you need to go out more. But, but thank you very much.